easier to track. So you can see up and down what's going on. At the time, this is Judah, this is Israel. So we're going to be right here with the overlapping Joash of Judah and Joash of Israel. So 2 Kings 13, we'll start with the first 3 verses. In the 23rd year of Joash, the son of Ahaziah, king of Judah, Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, began to reign over Israel and Samaria, and he reigned 17 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and followed the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. He did not depart from them. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them continually into the hand of Hazael, king of Syria, and into the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael. So Jehoahaz is the son of Jehu, and Jehu, of course, was this tremendous leader of Israel, made a lot of military reforms, kind of overthrew the bad stuff that was going on and took over. We do read that he didn't follow God wholly with his whole heart, but he did get a lot of things done. He did a lot of the things that God commanded him. He just fell a bit short when it came to the commitment of his heart. But since he did quite a bit right, it gets back in chapter, back in chapter 10, God promises that to the 4th generation, his sons will be on the throne. That's in chapter 10, verse 30. The Lord said to Jehu, because you have done well in carrying out what is right in my eyes and have done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, your sons of the 4th generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. And so we see that here. Right here, we're going to see Jehu's descendants to the 4th generation are going to reign in Israel. So Jehoahaz is the first of those. He is the son of Jehu, and he does what is evil in the sight of the Lord. That's his summary. And again, Jehu was not the greatest moral guy. He did do what he was commanded. He did a lot of good things as far as overthrowing Ahab's wickedness, but he didn't fully follow God. And obviously, in the raising of his children, they pick up on that and follow suit and do not turn to God, but do what is evil. So God continually gives Israel, it says, into the hand of the king of Syria during the reign of Jehoahaz. And we're definitely seeing a pattern here, which is, again, a fulfillment of a promise that God made. If you turn away, then you're going to be handed over to the other nations. And, when we think about us today, I don't see why we can't take away the same thought for us. On a national level, if we're a sinful, idolatrous nation, we can expect trouble to come. That's a pattern that's continued throughout history. That's the way it works. God gives wicked nations prosperity as well during certain periods, but they always fall in judgment. God uses different nations for his purposes, and eventually wrongdoing catches up to you on the national level always. Does anybody have any thoughts on that as far as applying that to us today? Is that what everybody else sees too?
Yeah, and we kind of saw that, with some of the kings from surrounding in Syria, those that even aren't, those besides the Israelites that turned to God, there were blessings on them. And we'll see them playing a part, and we'll also see, evil people being used to carry out God's promises, but we see people being blessed that weren't even part of the Israelite nation if they turned to God and accepted them.
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely true on a national level as well as on a personal level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're going to see here Israel is going to continue in sin, but God's going to keep blessing them and use them to judge Judah. So it goes back and forth. But of course, Israel does eventually fall. So we're talking about the leaders here, the kings, and when it's talking about this king did what was evil, this king did what was good, We are talking about the leaders of the land, the kings. So then when we get to talking about the judgment of the land, we need to remember that the peoples are following them. The heart of the people is also ebbing and flowing. And when God hands Judah and Israel over to the Syrians, it's not just because the kings were evil. It's because the people as a whole were idolatrous. It wasn't just their kings. And of course, through all that, there always was a remnant. There were people that were faithful. But the nation as a whole was judged by God. And so Jehoahaz here is an evil king. He's doing what's wrong, but also the whole nation, or the nation as a whole, is also following in this idolatry. And we saw that back in chapter 11, where we had this brief reform at the death of Athaliah. Jehoiada, the priest, makes a covenant between the Lord and the king and all the people. And the people make this choice to follow God. They tear down these altars and images. So it's not just the decisions of the king. It also is dependent on what the people's heart is and what they're doing. And that's important for us to remember as we go through this. Picking up in verse 4, then Jehoahaz, so this is after they've been handed over to the Syrians are oppressing them. Then Jehoahaz sought the favor of the Lord, and the Lord listened to him, for he saw the oppression of Israel, how the king of Syria oppressed them. Therefore the Lord gave Israel a savior, so that they escaped from the hand of the Syrians, and the people of Israel lived in their homes as formerly. Nevertheless, they did not depart from the sins of the house of Jeroboam, which he made Israel to sin, but walked in them. And the Asherah also remained in Samaria. For there was not left to Jehoahaz an army of more than 50 horsemen and 10 chariots and 10,000 footmen. For the king of Syria had destroyed them and made them like the dust at threshing. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoahaz and all that he did in his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Jehoahaz slept with his fathers, and they buried him in Samaria, and Joash his son reigned in his place. Verse 4 is very important for us. It's a bright spot here, and I think it's an important lesson for us to understand. All it takes is that one step back to God. Jehoahaz sought the favor of the Lord, and the Lord listened to him. He didn't get all of his life straightened out. He didn't get the nation or the people fixed. We see that they continue in sin. They continue doing evil. The kings following him do as well, his sons. But in this moment, he recognizes who God is, and he turns to God. And God heard them because of that and saved them from their oppression. And I think that's an important lesson for us when we think about leadership and the responsibility of that. Jehoahaz's simple decision here to trust God had incredible results for good for his people, even though they don't deserve it. His sons don't deserve it. The nation as a whole doesn't deserve it. But because he as the king recognized who God was and sought God, God listened to him and blessed the nation for generations after him because of this simple little moment here. And so no matter how bad it gets, no matter how far away they go, all it takes is that one king, that one leader to turn back to God, to seek God, and he will be found. And that's important for us to remember today. It does appear that this salvation that's talked about doesn't happen right away, but more so in the lives of his son Joash and Joash's son Jeroboam. That appears to be where the salvation from the Syrians takes place. Jehoahaz's son Joash defeats the Syrians 3 times. And then if we go over to 2 Kings chapter 14, verses 26 through 29, we see Jeroboam, which is the second Jeroboam in the line of Israel's kings. We see Jeroboam spoken of kind of as this savior. So chapter 14, verse 26. For the Lord saw that the affliction of Israel was very bitter, for there was none left, bond or free, and there was none to help Israel. But the Lord had not said that he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven. So he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, the son of Joash. Now the rest of the acts of Jeroboam and all that he did and his might, how he fought and how he restored Damascus and Hamath to Judah and Israel, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And Jeroboam slept with his fathers, the kings of Israel, and Zechariah his son reigned in his place. So Jeroboam goes on. Whether or not this is the specific Savior that's talked about in verse 5 of chapter 13, it kind of seems that way, but both Joash and Jeroboam went on to defeat the Syrians and to provide salvation to Israel. And again, both of them were wicked kings. Both of them did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord, but God is blessing the nation through them because of Jehoahaz's part here. So Israel's army has been destroyed by the Syrians. It says this is a continual, they continually are given into the hand of the king of Syria. And we see that that means the destruction of their army. It says they have 10,000 footmen, 50 horsemen, and 10 chariots, and that they've been made like dust at the threshing. And for comparison, if we go back to 2 Samuel chapter 24, this is at the census of David, which wasn't supposed to have happened, but it is handy for our historical references. 2 Samuel 24, verse 9. And Joab gave the sum of the numbering of the people to the king. In Israel there were 800,000 valiant men who drew the sword, and the men of Judah were 500,000. So from 800,000 soldiers down to 10,000 plus 50 horsemen and 10 chariots is a pretty dramatic catastrophe. That's 1.25% of their army remaining. So it was as the dust of the threshing floor. They were destroyed. Any comments before we move on? Okay, so in verse 10 we move on to Joash, the son of Jehoahaz, and this is at the same time that Joash in Judah is reigning, and they're both also called Jehoash, so Joash or Jehoash, reigning at the same time in both nations. It gets a little confusing. Verse 10, in the 37th year of Joash, king of Judah, Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, began to reign over Israel and Samaria. And he reigned 16 years. He also did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin, but he walked in them. Now the rest of the acts of Joash and all that he did, and the might with which he fought against Amaziah, king of Judah, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Joash slept with his fathers, and Jeroboam sat on his throne, and Joash was buried in Samaria with the kings of Israel. So Joash isn't talked a lot about here, other than he did what was evil. And we also, if we compare it to the Chronicles account, we don't get much more, because it's about this time the Chronicles kind of just switches and talks about just the rest of the kings of Judah. We don't really get the last of the kings of Israel here in 2nd Chronicles. So we don't see a lot of We're going to see a little bit of Joash's story over the rest of this chapter and chapter 14 as well. But we don't know a whole lot other than he was another evil king. He begins reigning in Israel right at the very end of Joash of Judah's reign. Joash of Judah reigns for 40 years, and this is in the 37th year of his reign that Joash of Israel takes over. So things in Judah are falling apart, and Joash over there has turned away from God, has had Zechariah the prophet killed, and Amaziah is about to take over in Judah. And then we'll see a battle here between these two kings next week. Israel though does do better through Joash's reign, again attributed to the prayer of his father. He does start driving out the Syrians, and temporarily they seem to be in a better place than Judah, which Judah's being punished for their sins. So even though Joash is an evil king doing what is evil, he does a few things right, and we do see that he has some respect for Elisha, the prophet of God. And so we're going to move on here, and we'll see Elisha's death and the end of that time. So picking up in verse 14, now when Elisha had fallen sick with the illness of which he was to die, Joash, king of Israel, went down to him and wept before him, crying, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And Elisha said to him, take a bow and arrows. So he took a bow and arrows. Then he said to the king of Israel, draw the bow, and he drew it. And Elisha laid his hands on the king's hands, and he said, open the window eastward. And he opened it. Then Elisha said, shoot, and he shot. And he said, the Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Syria. For you shall fight the Syrians in Aphek until you have made an end of them. And he said, take the arrows, and he took them. And he said to the king of Israel, strike the ground with them. And he struck 3 times and stopped. And the man of God was angry with him and said, you should have struck 5 or 6 times. Then you would have struck down Syria until you had made an end of it. But now you will strike down Syria only 3 times. So we see Elisha's little interesting stories here don't end until he dies, and even then, not after his death either. So we have Elisha here basically on his deathbed, and Joash goes down to him and is weeping before him. So there is some sort of acknowledgement of who he is. Joash does have some sort of an understanding that this is a man of God, even if he doesn't follow the God of Elisha, but he does have a recognition of who he is. God has revealed to Elisha this prophecy, evidently, that as many times as the king strikes the ground with these arrows, that's how many times he will defeat the Syrians. But of course he doesn't tell Joash that. He just tells him to strike the ground, and Joash stops after 3 times. And Elisha says, thus you will strike down the Syrians only 3 times. And of course we see this is what happens, and it's kind of a temporary battle against Syria through Joash's reign, and then Jeroboam will go on to conclude that. So Joash again recognizes Elisha as a man of God, but he doesn't follow God himself or lead the nation towards God. So it's just kind of an interesting glimpse here into his character. He didn't seek to have him put to death or anything. He does have some respect for him, but he does not follow him.
What's this deal with the grave and people falling into the grave? Actually get him up out of there.
Yes, this is Elisha's last little story here in verses 20 and 21. So Elisha died and they buried him. Now bands of Moabites used to invade the land in the spring of the year. And as a man was being buried, behold, a marauding band was seen, and the man was thrown into the grave of Elisha. And as soon as the man touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet. You just can't kill the guy. So evidently, there are these bands of Moabites that invade Israel in the spring. That's a pretty routine thing, just these little groups of guys that attack. And so we have this group of Israelites that are going to bury a man at the tombs. And I think this is, the way they would usually have these tombs carved out of the rocks, and they would roll the tombstones in front of them. So that's evidently what's happened with Elisha. And they're going to bury this other guy, and they see the group of Moabites, and they're like, well, here's the first grave, roll the stone, throw him in, and it happens to be the tomb of Elisha. And they throw him in, and as soon as he touches Elisha's body, he pops back up and walks out. And that's about all we know. We don't know the context. We don't know who this guy was. We don't know how old he was. If he was an old man that came back to life, or if he was whatever it was. We just get this little glimpse that even after Elisha's death, God is using that name, using that power to bring people back to life, which is pretty interesting.
There was an incident similar to this, and I never really considered it. Up here at the Anchor Point Cemetery, usually you have somebody in the family and they let you get buried there. I think it's free, but somebody didn't have any family, so they just put him in this open grave, and then you had to get some other kind of legal authority to, so when people would go through there was this grave with a casket in it, left open. I never heard of what happened, but it reminded me of this story, only the guy didn't come back.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I don't know exactly how the tombs work, if they normally bury multiple people. I would think they certainly wouldn't normally have thrown, because Elisha is a well-known prophet, wouldn't have planned on putting someone else in that grave. It seems like it was just a quick decision, like there's people coming, here's a grave, throw them in. Yeah. I mean, we've talked about Elisha kind of as a foreshadowing of Jesus and all the parallels there. And if we go over to Matthew chapter 27, after Jesus' death in 27:51, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. And the tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. And so there's another similarity, another example of Elisha as this foreshadowing of Jesus, even after death, opening the tombs and raising men to life. Any other comments? All right, and we wrap up verse 22 here. Now Hazael, king of Assyria, opposed Israel all the days of Jehoahaz, but the Lord was gracious to them and had compassion on them, and he turned toward them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not destroy them, nor has he cast them out from his presence until now. When Hazael, king of Syria, died, Ben-Hadad, his son, became king in his place. Then Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, took again from Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, the cities that he had taken from Jehoahaz, his father, in war. 3 times Joash defeated him and recovered the cities of Israel. So there in verse 22, it tells us that Hazael opposed Israel all the days of Jehoahaz. So this is another point that the salvation from Syria didn't happen in the time of Jehoahaz, but rather after his death, it would seem. God promises this salvation, and it comes in the time of his son and grandson, not in his time. So through all this, God is incredibly patient and faithful. He makes this promise to Jehoahaz to save them from the Syrians. And yeah, Jehoahaz's prayer of faith wasn't that beneficial to himself even, but rather to his children and his grandchildren. And God is patient through that. God waits through that. If we just turn to God in humility, that's all he requires. Hazael has been this thorn in Israel's side all these years. And we see that his son Ben-Hadad continues in that. But Joash fights back these 3 times and recovers these cities. And then Jeroboam does more than that. But again, Israel is not following God at this point as a nation. The kings are wicked. The high places are not torn down. They're still worshiping these false gods. We've seen multiple times where it talks about they're following in the sins of Jeroboam, which is the first Jeroboam there. And now we're going into the second Jeroboam. But the first Jeroboam, of course, built the altars in Bethel and Dan to keep the people from going back to Jerusalem like they should have for sacrifices. And those have not been torn down. The people are continuing in that sin. And again, that was Jeroboam's plan, to keep Israel separated from Judah. So he's been successful in that, and it's been this sin in Israel that they just can't wipe out, no matter how. Even if they have a good king come along every once in a while, they don't turn back fully. They still worship at these golden calves in Bethel and Dan. So that's what the sin of Jeroboam that's talked about is talking about, is this idolatry. But God is continuing in his patience a little while longer. He's faithful to his promises to Jehoahaz and also to Jehu. Jehu for the 4th generation, still sitting on the throne, and to Jehoahaz for providing this salvation from from Syria. And again, there are still some faithful in Israel. There is still a remnant. And along with the whole nation, those people are being blessed by God's patience. And that's the same for us today, even as we see our nation turning further away from God, as God is patient with that and gives us time to repent and turn and change. We are still blessed by God's patience. Does anybody else have any comments?
There in verse 14, what Joash says when he goes to Elijah is very meaningful. He says exactly what Elisha said when Elijah was taken from him, and making that reference to the great man of God there being taken. It's just drawing right back to that other time.
Yeah. And again, I guess we see that today. It seems like that's mostly all lip service. Joash doesn't really live out what he's acknowledging there, but I guess
It was the right thing to say.
Yeah, and we see that. That's right. Anything else? All right, let's prepare for worship. What do I have? Sure, yes. I knew that. I was on the schedule, but I didn't see that it was today.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, you're trading?
Yes.
You're doing songs?
Yes.
How are you? I'm okay. How about you?
Good.
Getting. Yeah.
How's that?
I think so.
I heard there were some issues.
Yeah, I think oh, yeah, either way.
Anyway.
That'd be way easier. Than trying to go through the phone. It's just-
Jeff's supposed to have.
Yep. Yeah, that should be all we need.
Is there a certain size?
Yeah, but it's in the evening, so.
Yeah.